You can cook for them. You can drive across the city at midnight because they said they weren't feeling okay. You can forgive the silence, the canceled plans, the sudden coldness that came out of nowhere, and none of it will make them love you more. Not one bit of it. That sentence should scare you a little, because if you've ever loved an avoidant, you already know how much of yourself you gave away trying to earn something that was never for sale. Here's the part nobody tells you. Avoidants don't run on effort. They don't keep score of what you did for them. Gifts don't move them. Grand gestures don't move them. Being endlessly patient and endlessly available doesn't move them either. There is exactly one thing they actually value. Just one. And once you understand what that one thing is, you will stop chasing people who were never going to chase you back. So, let me ask you something before we go further. Comment below right now, one word. Have you ever poured everything you had into someone who barely noticed you were doing it? If that's you, type yes. I want to see how many of us have been there because I think you're going to recognize every single thing I'm about to say. Let's talk about what's actually happening inside an avoidance mind, because it is not what you think it is. Most people assume avoidants are cold, distant by nature, incapable of love. That's not true, and it's actually the first mistake that keeps people stuck, loving one. Avoidants feel just as much as anyone else, sometimes more. What they don't have is a nervous system that feels safe when someone gets close. Closeness to them doesn't register as warmth. It registers as risk. Somewhere along the way, usually very early in life, they learned that needing someone was dangerous, that depending on another person meant eventually being disappointed, engulfed, or controlled. So, their brain built a very specific defense system. Not against love, against dependence. This is the part that changes everything. An avoidant is not protecting themselves from you. They are protecting themselves from the feeling of losing themselves. That's the whole game. That's the one thing you need to understand before you do anything else in this relationship. Now, here's where most people get it painfully wrong. They think the way to win an avoidant over is through effort, through proof, through showing them again and again how much you care. So, they cook the meals, they remember the little things, they text good morning every single day. They show up early, stay late, apologize first, forgive fastest, and for a while, it almost seems to work. The avoidance softens. They lean in. Things feel close, and then out of nowhere, they pull away. Not because you did something wrong, not because the effort wasn't enough. They pull away because the closeness itself triggered the exact thing their nervous system was built to avoid. The feeling of losing their own space, their own identity, their own sense of control over their life. This is why so many people end up exhausted in relationships with avoidance. You keep increasing the effort thinking more will finally be enough, but effort was never they're spending in. You could hand them the moon and it wouldn't register because the moon isn't what they're afraid of losing. What they're afraid of losing is themselves. So, what is the one thing avoidants actually value? It's simple, and it's going to sound almost too small at first. They value whether being close to you feels like freedom or whether it feels like a cage. That's it. That's the entire equation. Every single behavior you've ever seen from an avoidant, the pulling away, the sudden coldness, the mixed signals, the hot and cold cycle that makes you feel like you're losing your mind, all of it traces back to that one question running quietly in their head. Do I still feel like myself around this person, or am I disappearing into them? Think about the last time an avoidant pulled away from you. I want you to actually think about it. Was it after a fight, or was it after things got really good, after a weekend that felt closer than usual, after a conversation where you both said something real? That's not a coincidence. That's the pattern. Closeness itself is the trigger, not conflict. The better things get, the more their internal alarm goes off whispering that they're about to lose control of their own life. This explains so much of the confusing behavior people describe. Why an avoidant can seem completely into you one week and distant the next. Why they'll initiate contact, pull you close, and then vanish for 3 days with no explanation. Why compliments and care sometimes seem to push them further away instead of closer. It's not manipulation most of the time. It's a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. Protect the self from disappearing into someone else. Now, before you comment and tell me this sounds like an excuse for bad behavior, Let me be clear about something important. Understanding why someone acts a certain way is not the same as excusing it. You can understand the wiring behind avoidant behavior and still decide it's not something you're willing to live with. Both things are true at once. This isn't about making excuses for anyone. It's about giving you the actual information so you stop guessing and stop blaming yourself for something that was never about your worth in the first place, because that's the real damage avoidant relationships do. They make you question your value. You start thinking, if I was just a little more patient, a little less needy, a little more perfect, they would finally choose me the way I choose them. That thought is a trap. It keeps you shrinking yourself, hoping smaller will finally be safe enough for them to love you fully. It won't be, because the size of your effort was never the problem to begin with. Let me give you a picture of this, because it's easier to spot in a story than in a definition. Imagine someone who texts you first thing in the morning for 2 weeks straight. They plan the next date before the current one even ends. They tell you things about themselves they claim they never tell anyone. It feels fast, but it feels real. Then, right after a weekend that felt like the closest you'd ever been, the texts slow down. Not stop completely, just slow. Shorter replies, longer gaps, no explanation offered. You start replaying the weekend in your head, looking for the moment you said too much or asked for too much, but there wasn't one. What happened is that the intimacy itself crossed an invisible line in their nervous system, and the pulling away was never a verdict on you. It was a reflex. This is the pattern that confuses people the most, because it feels personal every single time. It feels like you did something. It feels like if you just figure out what it was, you can prevent it from happening again. But you're solving the wrong equation. The variable that changed wasn't your behavior, it was the level of closeness itself. That's why so many people in relationships with avoidance describe it as a hot and cold cycle. It's not random, it's a thermostat, and the temperature it's regulating isn't. It's how safe they feel inside their own skin. Please stop for a second. As I asked you at the start of the video to leave a comment. If you already did, thank you. If not, take 2 seconds and do it now. It really helps this video reach more people. Let's go deeper into what actually earns trust with an avoidant. Because this is where things get useful. If effort doesn't work and pressure definitely doesn't work, what does? The answer is consistency without demand. Avoidants don't trust big declarations. They trust patterns they observe quietly over time without ever being pushed to respond to them. When you say you'll do something and you do it without making a big deal out of it, that registers. When you have a bad day and you handle it without turning it into a crisis that requires their emotional labor, that registers. When you're upset with them and you say so calmly without collapsing or exploding, that registers more than almost anything else you could do. What avoidants are quietly watching for is proof that you will still be okay even if they're not perfect, that you won't fall apart if they need a night to themselves, that your happiness isn't entirely dependent on their attention. This is the single biggest signal that tells their nervous system it's safe to get closer. Not your love, your stability. That's a hard truth for a lot of people to hear, because it means the thing that actually works is the opposite of what your instincts are screaming at you to do. Every fiber of you wants to reach out more than they pull away. Text again, explain yourself again, prove one more time how much you care, and every time you do that, you confirm the exact fear their nervous system was trying to protect them from. That closeness means losing control. That love means being consumed. I want you to sit with that for a second because it reframes almost everything. There's another mistake worth naming here because almost everyone falls into it at some point. It's the instinct to test them, to pull back yourself not out of genuine need for space, but as a strategy, hoping it will make them chase you instead. Sometimes this works for a few days. An avoidant might reach out when the pressure disappears, relieved that the demand for closeness is lifted. But if your pulling back is secretly a performance designed to provoke a reaction, they can usually feel it even if they can't name what they're feeling. Manipulation, even gentle manipulation born from hurt, rarely produces the safety their nervous system is actually looking for. The only version of space that works is space you take because you genuinely need it, not space you weaponize to get a response. It's also worth understanding what avoidants are quietly evaluating in the early weeks of any connection, because most people never think to look for it. They're not evaluating how much you like them. They already sense that. What they're evaluating is whether you'll be reasonable when they need distance, whether you'll spiral into anger or panic, or whether you'll handle it like someone who trusts themselves. Every time you pass that test without even realizing you're being tested, trust quietly builds. Every time you fail it by panicking, chasing, or punishing them for taking space, the wall goes back up, sometimes permanently. This is happening in the background of almost every interaction long before either of you would call it a relationship. One more thing worth naming because it explains a specific kind of confusion people describe. Sometimes an avoidant will say the things you want to hear, that they miss you, that they see a future, that this feels different, and then behave in a way that completely contradicts it days later. This isn't necessarily dishonesty. In the moment they say it, they often mean it completely, but words and nervous system responses don't always agree with each other. Someone can genuinely want closeness and simultaneously feel physically unsafe inside it. Believing only the words and ignoring the pattern of behavior that follows is how a lot of people end up staying years longer than they should have. Now, let's pause here for a second because I want to hear from you before we go further into how to actually handle this in real life. If you've recognized yourself anywhere in what I've just said, comment the word freedom below. Just that one word. I want to see how many people watching this have been quietly shrinking themselves, trying to feel safe enough for someone else. And if you're new here, subscribe now, because next week we're breaking down the exact opposite pattern, that the anxious side of this dynamic and how these two attachment styles end up trapped in the same painful loop over and over. Type freedom, hit subscribe, and let's keep going. So, how do you actually apply this without losing yourself in the process? Because there's a difference between understanding avoidance psychology and using it to manipulate someone into loving you. That's not what this is. This is about protecting your own peace while giving any relationship, avoidant or not, the best possible chance to work. The first shift is internal, and it's the hardest one. You have to build a life that isn't waiting on their response. Not as a strategy to trick them into wanting you more, though it often does exactly that, but because your well-being cannot be hostage to someone else's nervous system. When you have your own friendships, your own goals, your own sense of identity that exists, whether or not they text back, something changes in how you show up. You stop negotiating from a place of fear. You stop checking your phone every 4 minutes. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head, trying to figure out what you did wrong. And ironically, that's exactly the environment an avoidant can finally exhale in, because you've stopped feeling like a cage, even if you never meant to feel like one. The second shift is in how you communicate needs. Avoidants don't respond well to guilt, and they don't respond well to ultimatums delivered in anger. What actually lands is calm, specific, low-pressure honesty. Not "you never make time for me," which sounds like an accusation. Instead, something like, "I'd love to see you twice this week if that works for you." One is a demand disguised as a feeling. The other is a clear, low-pressure invitation. The nervous system hears the difference immediately, even if the conscious mind doesn't notice why. The third shift is learning to tolerate their need for space without collapsing into anxiety every time it happens. This is genuinely difficult, especially if you lean anxious yourself, because space can feel like rejection even when it isn't. But if you can let them have room without punishing them for taking it and without secretly resenting them the entire time, you send the clearest signal possible that closeness with you doesn't mean losing themselves. That's the whole thing they've been protecting against their entire life, and you just proved it wrong without saying a single word about it. Here's something important though, and I don't want to gloss over it. None of this guarantees an avoidant will change, open up, or choose you fully. Some avoidants have wounds deep enough that no amount of patience or stability from you will be enough to override the fear. That's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of how much work they still have to do on themselves, work that only they can do. You can create the safest, calmest possible, and some people will still choose distance because distance is the only thing that ever felt survivable to them. Knowing this isn't meant to make you give up. It's meant to protect you from something that's slowly hollowing you out while telling yourself it's almost there, it's almost working. Just a little more patience. There's a specific moment worth watching for because it tells you almost everything you need to know about whether an avoidant is actually growing or just cycling in place. Watch what happens after you give them space without chasing. A healthy, growing avoidant will eventually come back on their own, softer, more present, sometimes even naming what happened. An avoidant who is not doing the work will simply disappear further, relieved that the pressure is gone, with no intention of closing the distance they created. Both reactions look similar in the first few days. The difference only shows up in what happens next. This is why patience has to have a limit. Not a punishment, just an honest limit you set for yourself. So, you're not waiting indefinitely for someone who has quietly decided distance is easier than intimacy. There are a few smaller signs that tend to show up before the big ones, and they're worth training yourself to notice because they save you months of confusion later. Watch whether they ever initiate repair after a disagreement, even a small one, without you having to ask first. Watch whether they can say the words, "I'm sorry," without immediately explaining why it wasn't really their fault. Watch whether they ever choose to tell you something vulnerable before you ask a direct question that forces it out of them. None of these things need to happen constantly, but if you never see them at all, not once over months of knowing someone, that absence is information. Growth doesn't have to be dramatic to count. Sometimes it looks as small as someone texting back the same day instead of 3 days later, or saying, "I needed space," instead of just disappearing without a word. Small changes tracked honestly over time tell you more than any single conversation ever will. It also helps to know what growth is not. Growth is not an avoidant becoming a completely different person overnight, suddenly comfortable with constant closeness and endless reassurance. That's not realistic. And expecting it will set you up to feel disappointed by someone who is actually making real progress in smaller, quieter ways. Growth looks more like someone who still needs space, but tells you they need it instead of vanishing. Someone who still feels a flicker of panic when things get close, but stays in the room instead of leaving it. The goal was never to turn an avoidant into someone who never needs distance. The goal, if there is one worth pursuing, is someone who can hold their need for space and their care for you at the same time without one having to destroy the other. Let's talk about something that rarely gets said out loud in these conversations. A lot of people watching this are not just dealing with an avoidant partner, they are one. If parts of what I described today felt uncomfortably familiar, not because of someone you're dating, but because of how you operate, that's worth sitting with honestly. Recognizing your own avoidant patterns is one of the most powerful things you can do because it means you get to choose differently before the pattern costs you something you actually wanted to keep. Awareness is the very first step out of any cycle like this, whether you're the one pulling away or the one chasing someone who keeps doing it. If that's you, I want you to know something clearly. Wanting space doesn't make you broken. Needing room to feel like yourself is a completely valid need. The work isn't pretending you don't need independence. The work is learning to ask for that space directly, honestly, and kindly instead of disappearing without explanation and letting the people who care about you sit there wondering what they did wrong. That one shift alone can change every relationship you have from this point forward. Let's bring all the way back to where we started. Avoidants don't care what you do for them. Not because they're cruel, and not because they don't feel things deeply. They simply aren't wired to register love through effort. They register it through safety, through the quiet, consistent proof that being close to you doesn't mean losing themselves. That's the one thing. Not your cooking, not your patience, not the 100 small sacrifices you've made, hoping they'd finally notice whether they feel free or trapped when they're standing next to you. That's the entire scoreboard, and most people spend years playing a completely different game without ever realizing it. So, here's what I want you to take from this. Stop trying to earn love through exhaustion. Stop mistaking your own shrinking for someone else's safety. If you're building a life that only feels stable when they respond, that's not security. That's dependency wearing a calmer outfit. Build the version of your life that stands on its own, whether they text back in 5 minutes or 5 days. Not as a trick to make them want you more, though it often will, but because you deserve to feel whole with or without their approval. And if you're on the other side of this, if you recognized yourself as the one who pulls away, let this be the moment you stop running from closeness and start learning to sit in it a little longer each time until it stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like home. None of this happens in a single conversation, and it definitely doesn't happen because you found the perfect words to say at the perfect moment. It happens slowly in the ordinary days between the big moments, and how you handle the small disappointments, the unanswered texts, the nights that don't go the way you hoped. Real change on either side of this pattern is built in those quiet, unremarkable moments far more than in the dramatic ones. So, give yourself permission to be patient with the process even while you stay honest about what you're actually experiencing along the way. Before you go, I want to hear which side of this you saw yourself in today. Comment the word freedom if you related to the person doing the chasing. Comment the word space if you related to the one pulling away. I read every single comment, and I promise you, whichever one you are not the only one watching this who felt exposed by it. If this video actually helped you see something you couldn't quite name before, do one thing for me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because we are going so much deeper into this next week, and you are going to want to see it.